agencies who provided the information necessary to prepare our budget forecast. As a reminder, Minnesota is one of 13 states that show a 4-year window into our state's budget and economic outlook in our twice-yearly forecasts. That enables us to not only gauge near-term economic conditions, but also to plan for circumstances that may arise in the next biennium. We analyze a large amount of data to develop our forecasts, and the forecasts represent the best financial projections that we can provide based on the information available when we prepare them. In this forecast, we continue to refine our projections for budget years FY26 and 27, which policymakers can use in their supplemental budget considerations. We also update our projections for the planning years FY28 and 29. After our presentation, we'll be happy to take your questions. Getting into the forecast specifics, we now project a budget surplus of nearly $2.5 billion at the end of the current 26-27 biennium, and that is $575 million more than our end of session estimate. Left unspent, the surplus carries over into the planning years, helping to reduce the projected negative balance in the next biennium. Speaking of the next biennium, we now project a negative balance of $2.9 billion in FY28-29. This is about $1.8 billion worse than the end of session, and that's driven by a worsening structural imbalance. You'll recall when I stood before you 9 months ago, we were forecasting a $6 billion negative balance for those planning years. The governor and legislature made significant progress last legislative session in reducing the projected negative balance. Thanks to their leadership, we are in a stronger place to respond to a more challenging budget situation. Clearly, there's more work to do to address the projected negative balance, but I do want to acknowledge the decisive actions taken by the governor and legislators earlier this year. They made a material and positive difference in our budget outlook. As you can see on the slide, we're projecting higher income tax collections in the near term, but slower economic growth will limit tax collections into the next biennium. At the same time, significant increases in healthcare costs increase forecast spending, putting more pressure on our efforts to achieve a structural balance. Our budget reserve now stands at $3.4 billion. The reserve helps ensure that if there's an unexpected drop in revenues in the current biennium, that we'll have some cushion to address it. It minimizes the need for large immediate cuts. This reserve, the healthy reserve, also helps strengthen our credit ratings. This slide shows a projected FY26-27 budgetary balance for this forecast in the middle column compared to the end of session estimates on the left. The column furthest to the right shows the difference between the two. At the top of the slide, you'll see that our beginning balance for the current biennium is nearly $10.3 billion, $2.8 billion more than our end of session estimate. If you remove the $1.9 billion in carry forward from that forecast change, the actual increase from end of session estimates to our November forecast is $949 million. Our revenue estimates are up about $1.4 billion from end of session, and spending net of carry forward is up about $1.6 billion. You'll note in both end of session estimates and our current forecast that we project spending will outpace revenues during this current biennium and the next, reflecting a growing structural imbalance. We've added $244 million to our budget reserve, bringing total cash flow and budget reserves to $3.8 billion. The projected balance at the end of fiscal years 26 and 27 appears under the lowest horizontal line. As you can see, we now forecast a positive balance of nearly $2.5 billion in FY 26 and 27. This slide shows the forecast horizon. Let's start with the column in dark blue for this to the left on the slide. This shows the $4.9 billion that remained unspent at the end of fiscal years 24 and 25. That then carried forward to become the beginning balance for FY 26 and 27. If we move to the teal column, you can see that $4.9 billion beginning balance is reduced by the size of our projected structural imbalance, or $2.4 billion. That represents the amount that our spending in FY 26-27 is expected to exceed our revenues collected. When we move to the dark blue middle column, you can see what we project to have left at the end of the current biennium after we've subtracted the projected structural imbalance. The remainder, $2.5 billion, will carry over to the start of FY 28-29. Moving to the column on the right, we see in yellow what happens when we subtract the projected structural imbalance in FY 28 and 29, which now totals $4.5 billion, plus the $935 million in discretionary inflation, and we take that off of the $2.5 billion beginning balance. We end up with what you see on the far right, a projected negative balance of nearly $3 billion in the planning biennium. If we were to not count discretionary inflation, which as a reminder, legislators are not required to budget for, we'd have a projected negative balance of slightly over $2 billion. Constitutionally and statutorily, Minnesota is required to enact a balanced budget for the current biennium, and we just did that, and clearly we've got a projected positive balance. But as you can see, spending decisions made this legislative session will have impacts on the planning years, where we anticipate still significant but manageable challenges. The legislature can address those challenges by continuing the work undertaken last legislative session to bring projected spending more in line with anticipated resources. With that, I'd like to invite State Economist Dr. Becker to the podium to cover the economic and revenue outlook.
Thank you, Commissioner Campbell. I'm Anthony Becker, Minnesota State Economist, and since Minnesota's budget and economic forecast was last prepared in February of 25, the U.S. economic outlook has seen minor revisions through the forecast horizon of 2029. Our macroeconomic consultants, S&P Global Market Intelligence, or SPGMI, released their baseline forecast to us on November 5th of 2025. In it, they assumed the federal shutdown would last 6 weeks, so they were only off by 1 day. They assume further easing of monetary conditions with the Federal Reserve lowering the federal funds rate target one more time this year and twice in 2026. They also assume that the effective tariff rate will be 18% and that tariffs will only fall slowly over our forecast horizon. They make no prediction about the Supreme Court's action on the tariff case before it, except to note that overturning the tariffs would lower the effective rate to approximately 9%. Finally, they assume that net migration to the U.S. will be 500,000 persons per year lower than the Census Bureau had in its population projections. In this chart, we have SPGMI's forecast for GDP growth through the end of the forecast period. The overall rate of growth rate of the economy does not show much change from February. There's slightly lower growth in 25, slightly higher in 26, mostly due to the low GDP growth in the first quarter of 25 and the shutdown, which SPGMI assumes will shift some final demand to 2026. As in February, GDP growth remains what we call below trend in 2027 and beyond. This means that employment demand is unlikely to be robust in the years ahead. Further, a low-growth economy can more easily slip into recession as the result of an adverse external shock. Real personal consumption expenditures, also referred to as real consumer spending, are a primary driver of growth in the economy, accounting for roughly 70% of gross domestic product. SPGMI now forecasts real consumer spending to grow 2.5% in 2025, 0.6 percentage points lower than their February 25 forecast. From 26 through 29, real consumer spending is expected to grow at 2.1% per year on average. This downward revision is a key factor contributing to the below-trend GDP growth projected over the forecast period. The low consumer expenditure forecast may be related to low consumer sentiment, which in turn may reflect uncertainty about inflation or unemployment prospects. It may also be related to increasing financial stress of households, as evidenced by recent increases in delinquency rates for many categories of loans. Private investment is forecast to experience historically low rates of growth through the forecast period, further suppressing overall economic growth. SPGMI forecasts that real non-residential or business fixed investment will grow at a rate of less than 2% per year in 2026 through 28. As private investment is about 18% of GDP, the low investment growth rate will be a short-term drag on GDP growth. Further, investment is necessary to build the capital base for production in the long run. In this forecast, the rate of inflation is not expected to be substantially different than that in SPGMI's earlier forecast. They now project CPI inflation will remain close to 3% through 2026, before falling below 2.6% in 27 through the end of the forecast period. SPGMI forecasts a roughly 12% downward correction in the S&P 500, with the market peaking in the fourth quarter of 2025 and declining through late 2028, when a gradual recovery is expected to begin. The accompanying graph compares the current forecast for the S&P 500 to the February 25 forecast. Many macroeconomic forecasters have been expecting a correction in equity markets for years, a correction that has yet to materialize. Equity markets present both upside and downside risks to this forecast. Households in the top quintile of income distribution hold a high proportion of the equities held by all U.S. households, and they account for over 1/3 of personal consumption expenditure. A downward correction in equity markets could cause outsized changes in personal consumption. Alternatively, continued growth in equity values could continue to support consumption and so present a possible upside risk as well. After a robust expansion in payroll employment following the COVID pandemic, recent job growth has slowed markedly. And SPGMI's forecast is for continued low rates of job creation through the forecast horizon. They forecast employment growth in 2025 will average 125,000 jobs per month. However, beyond 2025, employment growth is forecasted to slow significantly to roughly 35,000 jobs per month through the end of the forecast period. The lower level of projected job growth in this forecast reflects the changing demographics of the U.S. potential labor force, caused by an aging population and lower birth rates. Demographics, coupled with lower projected levels of immigration, further constrain potential employment growth. With only moderate growth in Minnesota employment expected in this forecast, increases in wage and salary income per worker will be the primary driver of growth in total wage and salary disbursements through the forecast horizon, rather than increases in the number of workers driving it. The lower forecast for wages per worker reflects revision in underlying variables and lower observed wage growth since February. Nonetheless, we still expect nominal wage growth will exceed the rate of inflation in Minnesota, which will raise real wages per worker and workers' purchasing power. Now to go to forecast risks. First and foremost among the risks to this forecast are the policy uncertainties at the federal level, especially regarding trade, tariffs, and immigration. Numerous trade deals have been announced, but few details have been made official, creating uncertainty about the nature, scope, and durability of the agreements. Trade uncertainty may induce businesses and consumers to take on less debt, suppressing both private investment and some forms of consumer spending. The administration's immigration policies also produce forecast risk through potential to create labor shortages in business sectors dependent on immigration for new workers. Disruptions from federal agency closures and contract suspensions and the effects of the recent shutdown create fiscal risks, as Congress may or may not restore funding and the administration may or may not reverse some cuts. The recent federal shutdown disrupted the usual collection and dissemination of federal statistical data, particularly economic data published by the Labor and Commerce Departments, including data on employment and labor, GDP and national income accounts, and price indices. The missing data due to the shutdown also clouds our picture of both inflation and labor market conditions, making it more difficult for us to assess the reasonableness of SPGMI's monetary policy assumptions. Equity markets, as I've already mentioned, present both upside and downside risks. And as always, there are 20 months remaining until the end of the current biennium, and it is difficult to forecast macroeconomic conditions with great precision more than a year and a half ahead. Moving to the revenue forecast. The first two columns of the table show the November forecast for the current biennium and the change compared to the end of session forecast. The second set of columns shows the November forecast for the next biennium and the change since end of session. Total revenues for the next biennium are now forecast to be $66.3 billion, 2.2% more than at end of session. Higher forecasts for individual income tax and other revenue more than offset slightly lower forecasts for sales and corporate taxes. We're now projecting individual income tax receipts to be 4.6% more than we projected earlier. This increase is mostly driven by a higher estimate for tax year 2024 liability and is consistent with the higher than forecast income tax payments and lower refunds for tax year 24, which we detailed in our July 2025 revenue and economic update. We estimate tax year 24 income tax liability is higher largely because capital gains, interest, and dividend income grew more than we previously assumed they would. Much of the higher tax liability carries forward into tax years 25 and 26, increasing the revenue forecast for the current biennium. Sales tax revenue is now forecast to be 2.1% less than in the current biennium than in our prior estimate. Our decreased forecast in gross sales tax receipts reflects weaker than expected collections since end of session and a lower forecast for consumer spending on goods and services subject to the sales tax. The corporate franchise tax is forecast to generate $6.2 billion, or about 1% less revenue than we forecast at end of session. As we've reported in our monthly updates, corporate tax receipts are running well below our end of session estimates due to lower estimated payments and from lower underlying tax year 25 liability. Corporations may be responding to recent changes in federal tax law, but nonetheless, because Minnesota is not an automatically complying state, we expect some of this shortfall to be offset by higher final payments in the spring of 2026. Other revenues are now forecasted to generate $9.7 billion, or 3.4% more than we previously forecast, primarily due to an increase forecast for investment income, the return the state earns on its cash balances, including the budget reserve. At this point, I will turn the presentation over to the State Budget Director, Anna Mingy.
Thank you, Dr. Becker, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anna Mingy, State Budget Director with Minnesota Management and Budget, and I'm going to walk through changes in the state spending forecast and then turn it over to the Commissioner, who will present on the state's long-term budget outlook. So the slide in front of you today shows anticipated spending changes in the general fund in the current biennium, which is 26-27, as well as the upcoming planning years of 2028 and 29. If you look at the very bottom, you can see that total spending in the current biennium is projected to reach $70.3 billion, a $3.4 billion increase relative to end of session, and the planning estimates have increased by $1.9 billion. However, when we isolate true changes in state program spending, the increases, though significant, are smaller. After adjusting for carry forward and discretionary inflation, forecast spending, if you look at the baseline spending line, is $1.6 billion, which is 2.3% higher in the current biennium, and $1.7 billion, or 2.6% higher in the planning estimates. Let me walk you through the table to describe what's driving this change. So the first line, E12 education, is $115 million higher in the first biennium and $288 million higher in the second, compared to where we were at the end of session. These increases are primarily driven by higher projected spending for special education. We have seen in recent months districts spending additional money to provide special education services due to both increases in pupils as well as higher costs for staff salaries and benefits. The next line, Health and Human Services spending, is about $1.4 billion higher than previous estimates in the current biennium and the next. This is clearly the largest change from previous forecasts on the spending side, and about 90% of it is due to changes in the state's medical assistance program. I'll talk about those changes in greater detail in a following slide, but let's just walk through the rest of the changes here first. So you can see property tax aids and credits spending is also above previous estimates by $84 million in the first biennium and $116 million in the planning years. This is driven by higher property tax refunds. The next line, debt service on state-issued bonds, is below previous estimates, primarily as a result of a smaller than anticipated bond sale and lower interest rates than we had projected in that bond sale. Historically, our spending forecasts have assumed that the legislature would authorize a bonding bill in each year of the forecast horizon. This is the first forecast that no longer holds an assumption about future bonding authorizations. In the 2025 legislature clarified that MMB should not make an assumption about future bonding bills, and this resulted in budget savings that were tracked at the end of session. What this means is that during the legislative session, future bonding bills will have a cost, the full cost of debt service will need to be tracked against the general fund bottom line. So you can see the next line, all other areas of the state budget are relatively unchanged from previous estimates. I'd like to discuss carry forward briefly before we move on and explain what it is and how it affects the bottom line. Previous slide, please. Thanks. So in general, appropriations have to be spent within a fiscal year or a biennium, depending on what they're for. But sometimes appropriations are given extended timeframes to be spent by the legislature. And when something is unspent in one period and then rolls into another period, that's referred to as carry forward. And appropriation carry forward is neutral to the general fund bottom line because it's reflected in our numbers as savings in 24-25 and higher spending in 26-27, but they are equal amounts and so they wash each other out. But they do make the spending story a little more complicated, so we wanted to spend a little time here. Appropriation carry forward shows up in every budget forecast. This isn't new, but what's new is the magnitude. And the reason that this is so much higher this year is because the 2023 and 2024 legislatures made significant one-time investments. You know, these were sort of in the spirit of some of the significant one-time nature of the surplus we had at the time. One-time spending investments allowed for sort of greater financial stability over time. But in recognition of the size of these appropriations and the time required to implement them, the legislature just gave agencies a little more time. Some examples of programs included in this number are some transportation and transit projects, lead service lines, and improvement to state outdoor recreation facilities. I'd also remind you, if you look on the next line, that our forecast continues to include an estimate of discretionary inflation. Now we are only seeing it in 28-29 because that's a biennium where we don't have an enacted budget. We estimate this to be $935 million, which is slightly higher than end of session due to a incremental change in the CPI forecast. This number is meant to be a guide for policymakers about the cost of funding government as prices grow. But it's important to emphasize this does not automatically flow to programs. The legislature needs to appropriate it. Now we can move on and dive into the largest driver of the spending forecast, the state's medical assistance program. So this chart displays changes to the MA forecast since the end of session. The solid line on top represents the current forecast, and the dashed line on the bottom shows where we were at the end of session. The shaded areas, the green and blue between the lines, represent higher general fund costs reflected in today's forecast. The value of those shaded areas from 2025 to 2029 is about $2.5 billion, with about $1.3 billion in the first biennium and $1.2 billion in the second. The largest changes in this forecast, compared to where we were at the end of session, are for basic healthcare services. These changes are represented by the teal in the chart. These are the things that, these are services someone might receive to treat an illness or an injury, and they're distinct from long-term care services or services some might receive in a nursing facility or home and community-based setting. In total, basic care spending is projected to be about $1 billion higher per biennium than we projected at the end of session. We have observed increases in the number of people being served as well as the average cost per person. The largest single impact comes from higher than previously assumed rates that we pay to managed care organizations. But we are also observing higher costs for services that are paid on a fee-for-service basis, places where states pay providers directly without going through a managed care organization. And as I mentioned, enrollment is also above previous projections. But spending on long-term care services is also higher than previous estimates, represented by the green portion of the chart. higher enrollment and cost increases in disability waiver services increase projected general fund spending by $300 million per biennia relative to end of session estimates. So we can move on and talk about the largest item, which is the increase in managed care rates. So updates to managed care rates account for $742 million of the spending change in the first biennium and $834 million in the second. Managed care is how most individuals on medical assistance access their basic healthcare services. The state provides monthly payments, referred to as capitation payments, to health plans to cover services for enrollees. Every year, the Department of Human Services works with actuaries to set rates for the upcoming year based on past experience and projected growth trends. During calendar year 2024 and 2025, managed care organizations experienced higher than expected costs, and this resulted in 2 increases to 2025 rates in the middle of the calendar year. Generally, these increases happen sort of at the start of every calendar year. These increases resulted in substantially higher capitation payments compared to what was assumed at the end of session across the forecast horizon. The table on the slide shows the impact of these adjustments. So what the percentage represents is how much higher those 2026 rates are per person compared to what we thought 2026 would be in end of session numbers. While the largest percentage difference is in adults without kids at 28%, the impact to the state budget is muted because that group has 90% federal funding. Sort of conversely, the smallest percentage change for families with kids is only 8%, but that has the largest budgetary impact because this group represents about 2/3 of our MA enrollees. Actuaries attribute about 3/4 of this change to increased use of services, and 1/4 to the fact that some services are getting more expensive. The one notable exception is that pharmacy growth, where increased use of high-cost drugs is the primary driver of growth. It's really important to note that this cost growth is not unique to medical assistance, and it's also not unique to Minnesota. Within Minnesota, individual marketplace plans are growing on average 22% from 2025 to 2026, and the state employee health plan is experiencing a 17% increase from 2025 to 2026. Similarly, a recent survey done by the Kaiser Family Foundation of state Medicaid programs reported that at least 19 states are implementing some sort of mid-year rate adjustment for their Medicaid managed care rates in 2025, largely increases to their capitation rates to respond to rising acuity among their population. So these changes are clearly a significant part of the budget story. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner Campbell to present our budget outlook.
Thank you, Anna. This slide shows a long-term budget outlook. It compares our forecast revenues against our estimated spending for the current biennium and the next, and that's without including any unspent projected balances or transfers to the budget reserve. It's what we refer to as our structural balance. As you can see, forecast revenues of $66.2 billion in the current biennium are expected to grow by 1.5% in the next, an annualized growth rate of 1.2%. Want to emphasize here that revenues are still growing, but at a slower pace than we had anticipated. During the same time period, we're expecting baseline spending of $68.4 billion to increase by $3.8 billion, or 2.8% on an annualized basis. If you were to include appropriation carry forward and discretionary inflation, total spending would be projected to grow 2.1% on average annually. So bigger picture, if we subtract the total forecasted spending in the planning biennium from expected revenues for that period, you end up with a structural imbalance of $5.4 billion. It would be $4.5 billion if we did not count discretionary inflation. You can see on this slide how our budget reserve has grown over the years, thanks to our nation-leading reserve policy. With the addition of $244 million, our cash flow and budget reserves have hit a record high of $3.8 billion. Those reserve dollars do not only protect us against an unexpected loss of revenue in the current biennium, they also help us to maintain our AAA bond ratings and our reputation as a financially well-managed state. So as we close out the presentation here, I would just say that despite a persistent structural imbalance, we are in good shape in the current biennium. We expect to end it with $2.5 billion on the bottom line, and again, that carries forward to the planning years, reducing the projected negative balance for FY 28 and 29. Looking into the planning years, we're currently expecting a nearly $3 billion negative balance that will need to be addressed in the next 2 legislative sessions. Fortunately, policymakers have demonstrated a willingness to make hard choices, and this remains a solvable problem. And there are several indicators pointing in our favor as we move forward. Again, we have a nation-leading automatic allocation to our reserve, and that means that we've got the funds to address an unexpected revenue shortfall should one occur. It's worth noting that we do not anticipate needing to tap into the reserve at this time. Our AAA bond ratings demonstrate the rating agency's continued confidence in Minnesota's responsible financial management and our history of taking action to keep the state on sound financial footing. As a reminder, Minnesota is one of only 16 states nationwide that currently hold this rating. Policy changes at the federal level, while concerning and even devastating for some Minnesotans, so far have not had as large an impact on Minnesota's state budget as we worried that they could have back in February. And because our forecasts project into the planning years, the governor and legislature have what they might need most to turn the projected FY 28 and 29 negative balance into a surplus, and that's time. The FY 28 and 29 budget does not need to be enacted for at least 18 months. In that time, they've got the time that they need to address the remaining projected FY 28 and 29 negative balance and align revenues with spending to keep Minnesota's fiscal house in order. And that's all really good news because today's forecast does make this a harder problem to solve. There will certainly be difficult decisions ahead as policymakers assess their priorities. As always, MMB will continue to watch for significant changes through our monthly revenue updates, our quarterly economic updates, and our close monitoring of federal actions, providing information legislators need to anticipate and respond to economic changes. And with that, we'll be happy to take your questions. Yes, go ahead. Can you speak up a little? Mm-hmm. It's a combination of both of those things, and I do think it's worrisome in so much as our ability to weather those structural imbalances has been impacted by the fact that we've been able to carry forward. There have been good decisions by legislators to leave quite a lot of money on the bottom line, and we've been able to carry forward significant resources from one biennium to the next, and that's really blunted the impact of those structural imbalances. But at some point that will catch up with us, and that looks to be in the next biennium, FY 28 and 29. And because we're required to have a balanced budget at that time, we will need to have addressed the structural imbalance by that time.
I heard the phrase federal impact several times in here for a while. Can you give us some context? Is there more federal impact on this forecast than what we've seen in recent years?
There probably is more of an impact. I would say it is. You remember in February, we were concerned that it could be a much greater risk than it has been so far. I certainly do think you see the impacts of tariffs. You see the impact of some of the impacts on healthcare and Medicaid spending, in particular if you look at some of the other funds like the Healthcare Access Fund. And then, of course, the broader economic trends that are happening as a result of some of those actions.
To what extent would you say the bill that Congress passed this summer is impacting the healthcare costs? If you're talking about how that's the largest growth.
I might turn that over to Anna to answer that question.
So the question is, to what extent did the HR 1, the Federal Reconciliation Bill, impact the healthcare costs that we've talked about today? I would say, in general, the managed care costs and some of these higher per person cost trends that we're observing are not the result of the federal reconciliation bill. However, there are some other changes, particularly around eligibility and retroactive coverage, that have contributed to those some of the incremental costs in the basic care space, and we can follow up with the exact numbers, but it's a relatively small portion of the change we saw today. Yep, so managed care costs are higher than expected. So in general, when DHS is working with actuaries to set their rates for the coming year, they're using, if you think about 2025, they had the data from 2023 and then part of the year of 2024. But they don't have complete data because you're always working a little bit ahead and there's always a little bit of a lag. And what we saw is that costs in 2024 and early 2025 far exceeded what actuaries projected. In general, about 3/4 of the growth that we saw is due to higher utilization of services, and about 1/4 is due to some of those services being higher cost. In one space in particular, pharmacy costs are driven by increased use of high-cost drugs. So with the kinds of drugs, GLP-1s are certainly a large part of the story, but I don't think that they are the entirety of the story. I know we talked about GLP-1s, in previous forecasts specifically. With the specific, some of the places where we're seeing some of the highest utilization changes are things like outpatient hospital and professional services, which is sort of like physician visits and other sorts of professional services. It's a great question. So carry forward was in all of our previous estimates, but in previous forecasts, it was spending in 24-25. And then if you dig into our numbers, you'll see 24-25 shows $1.859 billion in savings from not spending that, and then that shows up of $1.859 billion in spending. So they totally offset each other. They're just showing up in different years. So it was not in the end of session forecast because we hadn't closed the biennium yet and we didn't know that the money wasn't spent. But this was reported in October. We published a biennium close report, and we did sort of report on that at that time.
Do you have any way of knowing if fraud contributed to the rise of costs in DHS programs? Is there any data or visibility you have to shed light on what effect, if any, that is having on the budget?
I'll let the commissioner just.
Sure. So as Director Mengi has said, the healthcare costs that we see rising are largely driven by medical assistance. And that is on trend with what we are seeing in a number of other states and a number of other markets. There's also the increase in long-term care waivers. That is a trend that we've seen over time and talked a lot about in the past. So in terms of what's driving the increase in this forecast, I would not attribute it to fraud.
Did you account for fraud? Are there any numbers? I never saw a word. I never saw a dollar amount. Literally, we see $1 billion in cash. Was there any?
So our forecast is based on current law, and that includes some programs that are susceptible to fraud, but of course we would never forecast fraud. We would never include that in the forecast. And as you know, the Department of Human Services, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension are working very diligently to find and address fraud in state programs. Yeah, there actually are. Thank you for that question. The Housing Stabilization Services Program is no longer forecasted in this forecast because it has been suspended due to federal action. No, I don't believe it does.
Like, is that from forecast to forecast? You know, that money goes somewhere. So does the state, I guess, sort of, I don't know, where's that money come from? And I think the state loses that money, if that makes sense. I don't know if it's possible.
What I think, I'll try to answer the question I think you're asking. It to the extent that it's driving spending increases, it would show up in the increased spending in forecasts.
So is it just being accounted for as spending, not specifically as a line item of fraud?
Correct.
But just to be clear, spending forecasts are dependent on previous spending, and that is, you guys aren't, not able to parse out which part is forecasted from fraudulent spending in the past.
Yeah, we would. So this is a current law forecast. It is inclusive of all current state law programs and based on spending trends. Anna might know if there are any corrections that take place, which I think is what you're asking about. Just the housing stabilization services. That would not show up here yet, yeah. I know I can't, but perhaps Director Minke can.
Someone who made my binder knew someone would ask this question. So I think folks are generally aware that lower potency hemp and hemp-derived projects were recently decontrolled federally in 2018, but will be recontrolled in late 2026. Our current forecast does not account for impacts for recontrolling hemp, but we'll update those changes or make those changes and assumptions in the February 2026 forecast. One place where we know it will, so cannabis tax revenue will likely have some sort of impact due to the limited retail, but there might be an offset due to increased sale of other cannabis products. We know there will probably be an impact on licensing because some of these businesses do generate licensing revenue for the state, but the short answer is we don't have those impacts reflected here, and we would look for them in February. Right. So to the second question, that's right. That this is the full cost of the GO debt service will need to be paid for in the legislative session as a part of sort of target negotiations. The size of the bonding bill, we always in a forecast sort of make an estimate of how many bonds we will sell, and that was in February. But by August, when we were issuing the debt, we just had better cash flow from agencies about how much debt they needed at the time, because we don't like to sell bonds if our agencies and local partners aren't ready to use them. They've still been authorized. We're just waiting to sell them for when they'll actually be used. Right, that's right.
Perhaps Dr. Becker would like to speak to that, but I think that the concern there is really about the impact on consumer spending and the impact on the economy of limited consumer growth. Do you want to say anything else?
Yes, I'll echo what the commissioner said. The delinquency rates are a concern insofar as higher delinquency rates might cause consumers to pull back on expenditures, which would have an effect on the state's economy in general, possibly on sales tax revenue as well. But I'd also like to point out that while delinquency rates on credit cards and some other loans have gone up recently, we're nowhere near the levels we saw during the Great Recession. And so it's something that bears watching, but I don't think it's reached the point of real concern right now. But certainly we'll keep an eye on it.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Before we get into the budget, though, I want to start off and address the vile racist lies and slander towards our fellow Minnesotans. Donald Trump's calling our Somali neighbors garbage and the state of Minnesota a hellhole is, I'm assuming, is unprecedented for a United States president. We've got little children going to school today who their president called them garbage. This shouldn't be that difficult of trying to conflate. Look, we see it here. You commit crimes, you go to jail. Doesn't matter what your race is, what your ethnicity, religion. But demonizing the entire group of people by their race and their ethnicity, a very group of people who contribute to the vitality, economic, cultural of this state, is something I was hoping we'd never have to see. This is on top of all of the other vile comments. So let's be very clear. This should be easy to differentiate. You should very easily be able to say, we need to continue to work together. If there's crime, whether it's white, black, who cares, but to be able to condemn this. So I would just be very clear on this. Anyone in this state, especially elected officials, who are unable to condemn this vile attack on our neighbors in our state, you are complicit in it, and it will not stand in Minnesota. So I tell our Somali neighbors, I tell our Hmong neighbors, I tell all of our neighbors in Minnesota, you're respected, you're valued. We're proud of this state that ranks near the top in almost every single category. And I will tell you, the only thing that's hurting this state, as he so falsely claimed to a group of people, is Donald Trump himself. So with that, I want to thank MMB. Commissioner, thank you. Budget Director Mingy, Dr. Becker, thank you for that. Today, despite a worsening economy nationally, as you've seen, and because of the destabilization of the economy, the tariffs, and a lot of other things going on, Minnesota's financial position is better than when we came last time. We have recognized challenges remain out over the next 4 years, but we've grown the surplus. We have historic rainy day funds, and economic indicators still show growth here outpacing the national average. This is due in a large part to responsible budgeting. Over the last 7 years, but the last one was a tough one. I put out a very difficult budget last year. I think as you see the numbers that came up on here, we would have been better served if we would have fully enacted that budget in the cuts that I proposed that were far greater than we were seeing coming out of the legislature, but we compromised and we got it done. And now Minnesota sets in a position, as I said, rainy day funds that are historic, a budget surplus this year, protection of the very programs that we care deeply about, and we can do it again, a plan to come together. But we're facing heavy headwinds. You saw it here and you hear it from our folks. Uncertainty we're seeing comes as no surprise to any person in this state. It's no surprise to anybody who's looked at their projected health care bills coming up. It's no surprise to anybody who's gone out and shopped for groceries. It's no surprise to any farmer who has seen lost markets, or any farmer who knows that bankruptcies have doubled since January in the ag economy. It's no surprise that $40 billion sent to Argentina would have certainly been better spent here on our markets with our folks. It's no surprise to teachers trying to figure out how to make do, especially around special ed, with the destruction of the Department of Education, or any county administrator that now absorbs the bills from the big, beautiful bill that is now being pushed onto them. The president has created chaos in our economy. He sat in the Oval Office and told you, and if we listened to him and budgeted, here's what he said. He said inflation was at record highs when he took office, and it's now non-existent. That's a false statement. It was 3% in January, it's 3% now. He told us that drug prices have come down minimum of 500%. So I'm assuming you all have your checks that you get every time you go purchase drugs. He's told us that soon the income tax will go away and states will receive money from the tariffs. He's told the American people every single one of them will receive $2,000 checks. That was following up the Doge checks. If we were to create a state budget based on what the President of the United States said to the nation in a cabinet meeting, we would have chaos beyond anything that's seen. The good news is that's not going to happen. We're going to do what we've done for 7 years. We're going to sit down together. We're going to budget in the best interest of the people of Minnesota. We are going to invest in the things that make Minnesota rank first in quality of life for our children, near the top in health care. All of the things that we measure by while making sure we have long-term fiscal stability. So last year, we made smart, thoughtful decisions, and there were cuts. I'm not going to tell anybody that those were not painful. The growth, especially in the disability waivers, was outpacing where we're at. We made those tough decisions, and that's what puts us in a better place where we were. But as I said last year, that was just the first step. I think over the next coming months, you will see us put out a budget very early into the next year before the session starts that will look very similar, I'm anticipating, to what we were able to do last year. That puts us in a solid position. So look, the uncertainty that's being reflected, the chaos that's coming out of Washington, the things that are happening there, we can't control that. But in Minnesota, we can control the ability to do what we do every single year, create good, solid budgets based on factual data. We're glad to report them. We will continue to try and make government more efficient. We will continue to take and tackle the issue of fraud, of people defrauding the people of Minnesota and the state of Minnesota. We know now that those programs have been paused. We have an independent auditor from the outside. We've enacted new powers that we have to stop payments and to be able to make sure that that snapshot of what's there is. The people who did it will go to prison. And as previous governors have dealt with fraud, my goal is to make sure that those going forward have much better tools, much more safeguards around programs to be clear that improve people's lives, that help, whether it's children with autism, whether it's childcare, whether it's housing, whether it's food, nutrition, and those things are absolutely paramount. But I want to be very clear. You can do that without being racist and vile and putting people at risk. You can do that by acknowledging where there's tools to be done and do so accordingly. You can do that without canceling programs that improve people's lives because a few people took advantage of the system. So I'm grateful to the professionals that helped make this happen. I'm grateful to the legislature that we were able to work together. And now we're going to have some acknowledgments that the federal government's not going to help us. The chaos is going to continue. We need to budget to protect Minnesotans as we had. And as I said, we're setting in a stronger place because we've done that. With that, I'll take a few questions.
Governor,
Yeah, Tom.
we were told that the budget forecast does not account for fraud in any specific way. Should there be a better effort made to quantify the amount of money lost to fraud?
We're doing it every day, Tom. I said we've got third-party auditors out there. We've shut these programs down for 90 days. We will have the first clear picture, I would argue, in Minnesota history exactly what the extent of this was. Certainly this is bigger on the scale where it happened, but we've seen these cases before, Medicaid fraud and other things. So I think it's really important to know where that's at. In a lot of these cases, it was federal dollars with a small matching from the state. But we will know, we will account for that. And I think, as you see, I'm very proud of this. I think our budgeting going over the horizon, being one of 16 states at AAA bond rated because of fiscal responsibility, putting in inflation, I think this suggestion of what we do going forward, is that just another safeguard to ensure we have the best budgeting? I think the fix to that is, though, is having a full accounting of where they're at and then the safeguards around it. Because the real goal here certainly is to catch people and put them in prison, but the real goal is to be on the front end to stop it. And I think some of these new tools, the stop payment that we have now, these people can go to court and try and sue me. They won't win now. They will get stopped on payment until we verify that. So it's a good point.
Governor, lawmakers have estimated the number at least $1 billion. Have you asked for that number, and do you have any?
I don't know where they're getting. I don't know where they're getting that number. So they're. I don't think we know yet. I think it certainly could be. We don't know on this. The one thing is when I hear it from legislatures, as everyone in this room and the press knows, is there's no data practices to know where they're coming from, so you can say whatever. We've acknowledged that this is serious, needs to stop. It is stopping. People are continuing to go to prison. I think the good news for Minnesotans to know, when that 90-day pause is over and the third-party audits are done, we will have a better picture than we've ever had, which I think is really good.
You asked the question, we did hear from
Yeah, the audits are not done yet. The audits are happening. They're doing the forensic audits outside of this. These are independent folks, not in state government, that are doing it. When that comes back, we will know. Is there a timeline on that? Yeah, I think it was 90 days. I don't know if is that correct, Commissioner? Yeah, so it should be end of January, I believe. Pardon me? When we get the audits back? I think we'll have a better, yes, I think we'll have a better, certainly in those 14 programs. And the thing that we've done is through executive action and through what we'll ask the legislature to do, when these programs were created, that's what's really important, to put the parameters around them at that point in time. We'll have a better idea to know, and we'll be able to, in the session, be able to put those forward.
We heard in the presentation the federal impact wasn't as bad as it could have been. Do you have a plan to address the price of healthcare costs and the long-term care studies?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And look, let's be very clear on this. The answer was, we don't know yet. Now, if they don't do the subsidies, if they roll back Medicaid, if they remove the income tax, and in this fever dream place or whatever, we yet don't know. And I think the important thing is Congress, after the longest shutdown, Congress led by a Republican president, a Republican House, a Republican Senate, the longest shutdown, simply kicked the can down the road. So those negative impacts I think you're seeing in this, and as you heard from Dr. Becker, those impacts are still yet to be seen, hard to measure. But in answer to your question, we did not go as deeply as I felt we needed to in my budget, and this is one where all of you can do that. There was a budget coming out of House Republicans and a budget coming out of me. My cuts were much deeper. And I think this forecast shows you what we compromised on tackled part of it. I think you can expect me to come back again asking for those cuts to be made to stabilize, especially in that waiver program and in some of the costs.
Governor, the U.S. House Oversight Committee sent a letter to you yesterday alleging maybe accusing you of having known about fraud as it's going on in state programs. How do you respond to that accusation?
Yeah. Dog bites man story. I spent 8 hours there, if you recall, and nothing came out of that. I asked them to give me data. I think the most ineffective Congress in history that Representative Comer needs something to do. I will gladly go. I think in the same missive he threatened former President Obama and others. Look, I welcome to talk to him. We handle this. I said whether this is COVID, whether it's George Floyd, whether it's daily budgets, whether it's 7 years of balanced budgets, whether it's making Minnesota a great state, I'll take responsibility for fixing these things. But these are folks that just point out problems and don't do anything. These are folks that, again, drug 3 governors in front of them on immigration. You heard the DHS secretary yesterday is complaining with a made-up number that 50% of our Somali neighbors are here on fraudulent visas, and that's my fault. You would think if you're the Secretary of Homeland Security that you would know the state has nothing to do with the issues of visa, that it's the federal government. So I will gladly comply with what they need. I would fully expect them not to do what Americans are asking them to do, reduce cost, do your job that you need to do in getting us a budget, invest in research, but that's not what we're getting out of them. This is just more distract. This is what you do. This is what President Trump, the reason President Trump is throwing racial slurs out, the reason he's throwing horrific slurs at me on Thanksgiving Eve or to Ilhan Omar is because he's failing on every front. It's because it's collapsing around him. And so we'll do our best to keep looking out for Minnesota. We can put out anything on there. Yes, you know there's. These are new programs, a lot of them. Some happened ahead of time. And I think for all of us, there have been these incidents, whether it's in Medicaid, Medicare, whatever it would be. And as soon as they're brought forward, we address them. We have commissioners that deal with them in each of that. We have the professionals who deal with them in each of it. When we bring them forward and we believe it's happened, we refer them to the BCA, who then refers them for prosecution. I can tell you one thing is, these are programs I care deeply about. These are programs, and I have a track record of doing this as being very fiscally responsible and fiscally conservative. I can assure you that there is no one angrier about this than me, because I know what the Republican response is to cut these programs. Just cut them in their entirety, and then we won't have to worry about them. So rest assured, as soon as I find out about this, and if it were up to me when we were talking about doubling penalties or whatever, fine by me. You put these people as long as you want. We'll be there to help.
What have you learned about the immigration enforcement operation underway in the state? Does the state have any information on how many people may have been detained? Do you have any concerns about the reports about how agents are conducting business? And looking ahead, what worries you about the shape this effort could take in?
Everything. Everything worries me about the way this immigration reform is happening. Masked folks showing up, not indicating who they are, and I want to thank the leaders, and I want to thank Chief O'Hara and others who made note of this, randomly terrorizing people. And Donald Trump made it clear. If there's no other story in Minnesota, the President of the United States called Minnesotans garbage and a hellhole. These are doctors, these are teachers, these are entrepreneurs, these are children, without any evidence whatsoever. And so I worry deeply about this. We're getting no communication. And I want to be clear. The folks they bring in here aren't the folks we normally work with. Our law enforcement, State Patrol, BCA, they have working relationships with people. These folks come in and do it and cause massive chaos. And then when Minnesotans step up and express their First Amendment rights, we have to send our people in, and they're confused on why St. Paul Police, Minneapolis Police, State Patrol is showing up on this, because we have no idea, and our responsibility is to make sure that they're safe. So I have to tell you, this is absolutely unprecedented. What I will tell you is it appears very little's being done. They bring these folks in from Texas or somewhere like that. I'm sure they're too cold to get out of their cars to harass people, but they're doing it in New Orleans. It's all about show. It's not about, they demonized an entire group, potentially 60,000 people, based on racial profiling. There are only about 300 people with the protective status that were here. So mothers, fathers, college students home on Thanksgiving. At the same time, we give a pardon to one of the biggest drug importers to the United States and the ex-Honduran president. And when it comes to fraud, by the way, we should be prosecuting these people in Minnesota, because you know what I fear about? Pardons from this guy. One of the biggest frauds, billions of dollars committed on this. A jury in America sentenced that guy to 40 years in prison. He served 12 days, and Donald Trump gave him a full pardon. So if you're concerned about fraud, and if the Republican friends come up here and start talking, they need to be asked, are you okay with that pardon? Are you okay with the president calling our neighbors garbage? Are you okay with him referring to Minnesota as a hellhole, unfactually untrue? This creates danger. And I'll tell you what, in my time on this, I'd never seen this before. People driving by my house and using the R word in front of people. This is shameful. And I have yet to see an elected official, a Republican elected official, say, you're right, that's shameful. He should not say it. So look, I'm worried. We know how these things go. They start with taunts, they turn to violence. So deeply concerned. The good news here in Minnesota is a budget that works, smart budgeting over the last few years that led us to a solid position. We will tackle crime, whether it's drug crime, whether it's fraud crime, and we will do it based on the individual who commits it, not a generalization to a group of people. And in spite of the headwinds we're up against, Minnesota ranks economically, economic growth, happiness, number of people insured, education levels, near the very top. So I'll tell you what, I have no interest in having this state look like Oklahoma or Mississippi. And if folks are going to commit crimes here, thinking because our generous spirit and our programs that we have is going to give them some kind of cover, they are sadly mistaken. So grateful to all the folks who work on this. Look forward to putting out a budget here shortly. Look forward to us moving into another legislative session. And as you heard the commissioner say, we've got time to do this. And I'm going to thank the folks who have been part of this again. One of the few states that budgets over the horizon, because if we did it like other states, the only thing you'd be hearing is we have a $2.5 billion surplus and everything's fine. That's lazy. It's not the way to do it. So adding in inflation, going over the horizon, gives us the time to budget without disrupting people's lives or cutting the programs that really matter. So thank you all. Thank you all.
Well, good afternoon, and I just want to thank the Minnesota Management and Budget team for the work that they've done. This November forecast is very important for us to get a snapshot of where we're at, and so I'm grateful for the work that they've done here for the state of Minnesota. But with this forecast, what we are actually seeing is the negative effects from those massive changes over regulation and overspending from one-party Democrat control back in 23 and 24. The projected deficit, as we've seen today, is nearly 3 times worse than what we knew and what we expected at the end of session. In 2028 and 2029, we were projected to spend $5.4 billion more than we collect in taxes. I want to repeat that again. We are projected in the years 28 and 29 to spend more than $5.4 billion more than we collect in taxes. And this is even after our Democrat colleagues raised our taxes and fees on all Minnesotans by over $10 billion last year. So over 4 years, spending is nearly $9.5 billion more than revenue. What that demonstrates to Minnesotans is we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem here in the state. We did last year do a great job of cutting state spending in last session, but our forecast, as we've seen, does show that there's a lot more work to do. And again, I want to thank MMB staff for pointing out that had we not, as legislative leaders, along with the governor, fought for spending cuts last session, the deficit would have been nearly 50% more than what it shows today. Last year, Governor Walz blamed increases in social service spending as the main driver of the deficit that was created. But we now know that much of that increase was the result of fraud. It's been pointed out that healthcare costs have increased, and that actually deserves a serious look to whether that increase is because of fraud. We've seen scandal after scandal after scandal of fraud in our social service programs on the current administration's watch. If fraud had been taken seriously, instead of dismissing the concerns and ignoring massive overruns in spending, that deficit would have been less than a third of what it is now. And likewise, if Democrats had budgeted responsibly back in 23 when we had an $18 billion surplus, instead of spending all of that and growing our government by another 40% without putting in those safeguards, we wouldn't be in this position that we're in today. We are, as it has been said by the governor, a very generous state. That doesn't mean, though, that we should sit back and turn a blind eye to when people are taking advantage of Minnesota generosity. It can't be allowed to be taken advantage of anymore. So the bottom line here is supported by this forecast information is that we have, again, both a spending problem and a fraud problem. And we will be addressing it when we return to session on February 17th. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Leader Niska for additional comments.
Thank you, Speaker Demuth. And we will take questions, and we are going to talk about the state budget. That might be a little different from the previous comments we heard from the governor. What we heard from the governor is really emblematic of the problem that Minnesota is in. We have long-term continued deficits because of bad policy from Minnesota and continued attempts to deflect from that bad policy by talking about federal policy that has nothing to do with the problems that we have to deal with in Minnesota. We're seeing reduced growth in our state economy because of the explosion in the size and scope of state government, and we're seeing increased cost at the local government level and the school district level because of the mandates that Democrats have forced on local governments and on all employers. Those are the long-term problems that we have to deal with. We need pro-growth economic policies, and we need to bring the size and scope, and most importantly, the fraud in state government under control. What we saw instead of that from the governor was someone who wants to talk about everything other than his failed policies, and in fact wants to show, again, the real reason we've gotten into this huge fraud problem in the first place. This administration, led by this governor, is more concerned about who they're offending than about actually protecting our tax dollars. And that is wrong. That's embarrassing. The governor should be embarrassed. The entire administration needs to take accountability for the problems that they have created. Those are the big, long-term budget problems we have to deal with: economic growth and fraud. We heard nothing about that from the governor. Instead, we heard mostly about federal policy issues that are relevant to a job he ran for and didn't get, but not relevant to the job that he is supposed to be doing for the people of Minnesota right now. And that's a shame. To jump from spending an $18 billion surplus, raising taxes, new mandates, billions of dollars in fraud, to try to blame that all on Trump requires staggering mental gymnastics. And I should certainly hope that the people of Minnesota are tired of it and are ready to see through it. And that's what this budget forecast and the comments we heard from the governor with no questions really shows about where we're at. Hopefully, we can get a change in leadership on that front. And now I'm going to turn it over to Senator Pratt.
Well, thank you. I'm Eric Pratt. I represent Senate District 54, which is most of Scott County, and I'm the Republican lead on the Senate Finance Committee. The billions in tax increases that were implemented by the trifecta aren't enough to keep up with the out-of-control spending and fraud that we've seen from this governor and from the legislative Democrats. Look, tax collections are up. 66 billion, 67 billion, 67. Spending is up. Thank you for somebody who laughed. Spending is up, and we're still have a structural spending problem. We are still spending $2.1 billion more this biennium and $4.5 billion more next biennium. You know, I was kind of surprised to hear the governor talk about his budget because he was more interested in cutting disability services than he was rooting out and stopping fraud. And had we implemented his budget, we would have pushed billions down to our counties that would have resulted in the largest property tax increase in state history. And so the question I have is, how does higher taxes and higher spending make it more affordable for Minnesota families? And I'm happy to answer any questions along with my colleagues. Thanks.
Do you have a plan for addressing the two big drivers that MMB mentioned, the continuing issue over long-term care and then healthcare costs?
So as we're looking at the increased drivers and those costs as mentioned, the legislature has a lot of work to do. We have just a short session this year, and as we've seen, there is guidance given by MMB to be cautious in our spending. We do have to get a hold of what those drivers are. And again, the mandates that we have seen on our businesses affect every aspect of the business that happens here in Minnesota, including healthcare, nursing homes, and those all are put on and increasing the cost for everyone. As the legislature does its work along with our, again, we're tied in the House, and so we've got the co-chairs. As we came forward with the budget this last year, it wasn't walking into the end of negotiations with a Republican House budget and a Democrat House budget. We had a House budget worked on. That is what we'll continue to do, to look at the cost drivers and find fixes for that. Yeah, thank you for that question and that comment too. I was very surprised because fraud is something that has gone on prior to my time in the legislature when I came in 19. But as we have been raising those red flags over and over and over, it seemed to go just really ignored except for the last year, year and a half. So the fact that that has not been accounted for, what we know, the U.S. Assistant Attorney had said there is over $1 billion in fraud in the state of Minnesota. And yes, investigations will continue. That was also said by the U.S. Assistant Attorney's Office that that was the tip of the iceberg. So to have a state budget that didn't even nod to the fraud, that is something that I think was definitely a miss, and we have to continue looking at that. That is not, it needs to